Thanks, Marianne. I'm not sure that I have anything less gloomy to say, but I will try to do so. What I wanted to do is talk a little bit about international humanitarian law and nuclear weapons. Also talk a little bit about the Australian approach to nuclear weapons, and if there's time, I will also mention a little bit about the Red Cross initiatives, and perhaps if there's not time, that might be a suitable source for questions at the end. So, as Marianne has already pointed out, there is no clear prohibition in international law that specifically deals with nuclear weapons. There are a number of legal frameworks, and we don't have time to explore all of those this evening, but they of course include the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I know Jenny will be speaking a little bit more about. She's soon off to the review conference for that treaty. There's also nuclear-free zones, and there is the proposed ban initiatives, and a lot of that coming out of the Humanitarian initiative. So by the end of the three presentations, hopefully you will have a good grasp on where those initiatives are at. But I wanted to focus a little bit on international humanitarian law and what it says about weapons generally, because it doesn't specifically mention nuclear weapons. And indeed, the Geneva Conventions, the central documents of international humanitarian law, don't specifically mention any particular weapons. Rather, they set up principles by which weapons who breach those principles are therefore deemed unlawful. And it is my view, and of course the view of many, that it is not possible to detonate a nuclear weapon without breaching those principles. So I'll just take you briefly through those three principles about weapons law under the international humanitarian law framework. And as I do, perhaps you can reflect on some of the statistics and quotes and images on the last slide that Marianne shared with you about the health, environmental, climate, social effects of these weapons. So the first rule of weapons law in times of armed conflict is that you cannot use a weapon which has indiscriminate effects. So basically, the rules of war have this idea behind them that everything that's military is fair game, and everything that is not military is off limits. And so under the rules of war, if you can use a weapon in such a way as to only target military personnel or military objectives, then, provided you're complying with all the other rules, you are allowed to use that weapon. Now, of course, you can make arguments that say, well, if you had a military base in a desert and it was completely isolated, then maybe you could use a nuclear weapon in a way that is able to target only the military objective. I think when we go through the second two features of weapons law, that argument falls down. But of course, there's the other issue that, well, if you're doing that, you can clearly achieve that military objective with other weapons, and therefore the only purpose for having a nuclear weapon is for targeting in a way that goes beyond just targeting military objectives. The design feature of a nuclear weapon is intended to be, and their only reason for existence is to have a magnitude that is thousands and thousands of times greater than normal weaponry. And I think Marianne's imagery and chart indicated that really clearly, because we know from reports and from ongoing health concerns and environmental concerns the effects of what is, by today's standard, an incredibly small nuclear weapon being used. So I would argue that nuclear weapons are an inherently indiscriminate weapon and therefore wouldn't be able to be used under the laws of war. The second principle, however, and these are not cumulative principles, but if you disagree with that argument, the second principle is that you cannot use a weapon which causes unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury. I'm not sure that I need to say much more about that, and I've included a couple of images just as background for my talk, but one of them, of course, is a burns victim from the bombing of Hiroshima, and that is a very friendly on the eye picture in comparison to most of the pictures that you get when you Google, Hiroshima victims. There is certainly, it's certainly very clear that these weapons cause a great deal of unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury, and indeed that's on a scale that no other weapon even comes close to. The point was also made by Marianne in terms of emergency response. So to use a weapon that the World Health Organization, the British Medical Association, the American Medical Association, and more recently the International Red Cross Organization have indicated that they have no capacity to respond to, is also going to be a factor in causing unnecessary suffering. And if there is no ability for emergency response agencies to respond, the suffering, of course, is going to be significantly greater. So I think it's very clear that the health and the human consequences of these weapons are beyond compare, and they effectively embody what is a unnecessary suffering from a weapon. There's also the figure that links to the third principle of weapons law, which is that even today, the Japanese Red Cross Hiroshima Atomic Bomb Hospital sees an average of 2,408 new atomic bomb survivors every year. And so that was a figure from, I think, sort of about the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s. That hospital was still seeing new patients at that kind of figure annually, which, as I said, links into the third principle: you cannot use a weapon that causes widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. And I might just point out here that this principle has nothing to do with the environment for the environment's sake itself. The principle is around the protection of the civilian population. So the idea is that if you destroy the environment so much so that the civilian population cannot use that environment to survive, then you have breached the rules of war. And the contamination, and again referring to the statistics on climate change from a nuclear explosion, makes it really clear that these are weapons that cause widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, and obviously intergenerational health effects as well. So I've thought about this quite long and hard for 5 years in particular, and I haven't been able to come up with a scenario where you could lawfully use a nuclear weapon. But of course I'm quite conscious that in 1996 the International Court of Justice, when they were asked about the legality of the use or the threat of use of a nuclear weapon, had a slightly different view, in the sense that they effectively couldn't really decide whether there were any circumstances where you might be able to use a nuclear weapon. And they did say that a situation of the self-defence of a nation is a possibility where they can't rule out the use of a nuclear weapon being lawful. So in that judgment, the court found that the use of the weapons would have to be compatible with international humanitarian law, but by 7 votes to 7, with the President's casting vote, they held that in view of the current state of international law and the elements of fact at its disposal, the court cannot conclude definitively whether the threat or the use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defence, where the very survival of the state would be at stake. I think for many who've tried to work out what this means in terms of international humanitarian law, it's not a particularly helpful judgment, and there are certainly a number of judges who make very unequivocal statements that there is no way that international humanitarian law and nuclear weapons can be compatible. My concern with the analysis relates to the fact that I believe they considered the principle of proportionality, which is an international humanitarian law principle which says if you are attacking a legitimate military objective and there is going to be some civilian damage or collateral damage, then that collateral damage must be proportional. However, that analysis appears in, the sort of overall judgment to have come without the question of the indiscriminate effects being asked in the first place. So whilst there are a number of statements about these weapons and their effects not being able to be limited in time and space, and other very strong statements about their inability to distinguish, actually when it comes to the reasoning around their possible use in cases of self-defence, that reasoning is in the context of we're essentially skipping the distinction question and we're jumping straight to proportionality. And in that sense, they are not analysing whether there is a case where you could use these weapons in a way that wouldn't breach the principle of indiscriminate effects. So if there is any uncertainty, and I think there is some uncertainty created by this particular judgment, there is hope, I guess, now that some of that uncertainty may be resolved by the humanitarian initiative leading to a very clear and unequivocal ban treaty. I know Jenny's going to talk a little bit more about this, and we'll have slightly different perspectives. And I'm certainly conscious that Jenny and Marianne have been in this space for a lot longer than I have, and that many people and many generations have been involved in the anti-nuclear campaign. But I would say that when I started working on this file 5 years ago, I was probably quite pessimistic. I sort of thought, look, lots of people have tried really hard to sort this problem out and failed, so why is it suddenly going to all come together in my time working on this? And I think after the Vienna meeting, which Jenny and I recently attended, which was the third intergovernmental meeting of considering the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which started in Oslo in 2013, and really I think has come quite a long way. I do think that there is quite a lot more optimism, and there is definitely a possibility of a ban treaty in the not too distant future, in my view. I don't think it will include any signatories who are nuclear weapon states, but you've got to start somewhere with a process. So I certainly look forward to hearing Jenny's further reflections on that, but I must say I do feel there is a lot more optimism than there was 5 years ago, when groups such as the Red Cross and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons really kicked this off. Now, I'm very conscious of time, but I do just want to make a couple of observations about Australia's involvement with nuclear weapons. And I think, as you'll know, Australia does not and has not ever possessed nuclear weapons, although the idea of us possessing them was discussed quite regularly during the 1950s and 60s, which I was quite interested to learn in my research. However, as I'm sure, again, we're all aware, nuclear testing has been conducted in Australia. Nuclear weapons with yields of between 1 and 60 kilotons were tested between 1952 and 1963 by the United Kingdom. And in reading the Royal Commission's report into these nuclear tests, I was very interested to note that this came about, an agreement to British nuclear testing in Australia came about through essentially a personal memo from the British Prime Minister to then Prime Minister Menzies, with immediate agreement to the proposal. Documents that were put to the Royal Commission indicated that there was no consultation with anyone else, there was no consultation with Cabinet. It was just what Australia would do because the United Kingdom asked. Interestingly, the United Kingdom also said there will be contamination in the areas for 3 years following the tests, which of course has proven to be a slight underestimation of the effects. And the documentation from the Royal Commission is extensive in looking at the long-term health effects of the Aboriginal people in the area, and also the servicemen who were involved in those tests, and of course the clear environmental impacts. And in working on this project, I've had the opportunity to speak with a few people, including Yami Lester, who is an Indigenous man who was blinded by the testing, And you know, when you have the sort of personal experiences, it makes it all very clear. So the British testing obviously took place, as I said, up until 1963, and as that testing was coming to an end, it was quite clear that the Australian public opinion, anyway, in relation to testing had changed significantly. So the French nuclear testing in the Pacific, which followed not long after, was something that Australians, and then because of that objection, the Australian government made quite significant international issue of. And you know, there's some quite interesting approaches to the diplomatic communications in the 60s and 70s between Australia and France. And then there's also little things like the Roland Garros club flag being flown at the Australian Open instead of the French flag, because of the Australian public's objection to the test. So the sentiment after seeing the testing in Australia had obviously changed quite significantly. I think to then look at where we are today, we've certainly changed from an approach of accepting proposals from the British government to allow nuclear testing on our soil, to accepting the American government's view of nuclear weapons policy. And I think it's quite clear that that's a very strong part of Australian defence policy, and indeed if you read the white papers of defence white papers, and indeed there's a new one due out this year, Australian acceptance, or Australia wanting essentially to have American nuclear deterrence is a significant part of defence policy, and has been for successive white papers. However, it did seem with the Rudd government that there were some indications of a change in this policy. The 2009 white paper spoke about the policy being one that had a time frame on it, and it was indicating that the position may change. There were a number of statements made by Prime Minister Rudd and also the Australian establishment of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. In 2012, you then had a parliamentary motion which supported a world free of nuclear weapons. So there did seem like there was some, at least, public change in the approach. However, since then, certainly in October 2013 and 2014, there's been what I think it's fair to say is an undermining of some of the humanitarian initiatives by the Australian government, which is obviously of concern to those who believe that Australia could have a significant role to play in helping lead towards this important humanitarian initiative. So in the United Nations General Assembly First Committee, New Zealand has put forward statements that have been quite strongly supported by the international community, and Australia has put forward alternative statements that use significantly less strongly worded support for, you know, the vague objective of a world without nuclear weapons. And essentially Australia's view is, and Foreign Minister Julie Bishop in February 2014 put the view, I think, quite well in terms of what their view was that a push for a ban on nuclear weapons might be emotionally appealing, but the reality is that disarmament can't be imposed this way. This would divert attention from sustained practical steps needed for effective disarmament. In my research, I'm looking at weapons in a variety of contexts, and it seems that an awful lot of weapons have been banned before they've been eliminated. So the Australian view that you can't ban a weapon before it has been eliminated is quite baffling. And I think that to say we're taking this approach, but we really believe in a world free of nuclear weapons is not really in the spirit of that actual world without nuclear weapons. If you're not going to push for things like the Humanitarian Initiative, and you are going to say, well, that's a nice idea, but we can't have it in the order that you want it, then I'm not sure that you're really behind it. So I certainly have a few more things to say on that, and also happy to talk about the Red Cross initiatives, but I'll hand over to Jenny now, and hopefully we'll have some questions.